platforms. There's a lot of vocabulary there that is sometimes confusing, and the terms are often used in senses that are conflated with each other. But before I begin to sort of describe what each of these terms might mean and how they're starting to be used, it's worthwhile to note that the term public goods comes from economists, from economics, and it has a very deep meaning there. The discourse around public digital goods and infrastructures does borrow from some of those senses and tries to bring it about in terms of the way these goods and infrastructures are designed and implemented and then governed. But one must be cautious of the use of the term itself. The terms itself have two common elements, which is the notion of public and then digital. And then there are goods, infrastructures, and platforms. So I'll dwell on each of these terms before jumping into a little bit of what India has done in these three areas. So the notion of public itself is quite simple and straightforward in the way it seems to be used in the debate. It has a lot to do with being available for public benefit, and is also tied into notions of who finances. So typically financing of many types of public goods, public digital goods, have been by philanthropies or by states themselves, which means that notions of inclusivity, universality, etc. start to come in. It also sort of relates to who is included, because very often they are implemented or imagined in like development contexts, which means that the notion of, again, public comes up quite significantly. It also comes up in terms of the kind of problem or the kinds of problems they seem to be solving, which usually relate to public welfare. Typically, these goods and infrastructures have been imagined in contexts where there are sort of large questions of public benefit and public gain involved. So again, that notion of public comes in. The notion of digital itself, I think, is far simpler to understand. It's non-tangible, typically computer systems that underlie, it's a digital system at the heart of it. Though, of course, there are layers of both community and governance that are involved in all of these systems. So I think it's cautious to park the word digital, but understand that at the core of it is a technological interface or a system or a set of systems. The notion of good infrastructure and platform in and of itself can be quite confusing, but one way of looking at it is to see goods as building blocks to infrastructures. So goods are typically the component elements. They could be exchanges, they could be registries, they could be databases. So the core goods are what are known as public digital goods. Questions around governance of these goods themselves typically relate to how do you design them, who uses them, etc. Whereas infrastructure could be understood as a sizable instantiation of these goods. So if you think about Aadhaar, for example, it would be a public digital infrastructure underlying which are various public digital goods. So infrastructures are typically aggregated, typically in an institution, and governance goes beyond sort of who uses it and questions of design, also into questions of inclusion, because they're anchored in institutions, they're anchored in legislative frameworks, they're instantiations of these goods, often in the context of governments. So, a digital infrastructure can be seen as one layer above. There are, of course, debates, and I don't want to sort of elide them, but yes, this is typically what an infrastructure is. The notion of platform, of course, is seemingly far less used now, but it appears to refer to a space or a platform or that hosts or becomes a site for instantiations of these goods. It can refer to standards in some instances, but I would stick to definitions around public digital goods and public digital infrastructures to understand and unpack this question. I did hear a question about India, but we could park that if you wanted to come back to it later, Deepak.
No, thank you very much, Sarayu. That was wonderful. I think, in many places, I keep hearing about whether Aadhaar is a platform? Is it a digital infrastructure? Is it a digital good? So I think getting that out of our way is very helpful for all of us. And India is very unique in the sense it's the only country which actually has this massive public digital platforms which are being deployed for public service delivery. So we'll now turn to Neeta to talk a little bit about some of the work you are doing, Neeta. Your work with the eGov Foundation involves using a collaborative approach between urban governance and health with digital platforms. So drawing on your experience, can you tell us a few practical examples of how these platforms are being used to improve public service delivery and access to public services? Over to you. Neeta, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Okay. Thank you. Very happy to be here on this platform. And I will dive into your question straight away. So look, I will respond this on the dimension of impact at scale, because DPGs are all about that, right? And a few practical true stories I'm going to share with you. So this is in Andhra Pradesh a few years ago. There's this girl called Padma, right? And who is a very informal community leader of a basti. The basti has a drain overflowing, not very difficult for all of us to imagine, right? She takes this Puru Seva app and she files a complaint. Soon the commissioner calls her, and within 6 hours, the drain gets cleaned. I'm talking of a very important aspect here, empowerment of our citizens, right? And then you look at from the municipality side, the ones who actually delivered the services. So this was a few years ago back, I went to Punjab in Zirakpur, and Balwinder Singh, he said, now I don't have to get up the ladder when people tell me their number and take out that file. I can do it on my computer, give them a printout, etc. And he used to say, oh, my 12th pass cousin has an app and I don't have. So I think it is about restoring his dignity. It is about reducing his time, which he can now spend with, on other tasks. So I think these are clear examples. But I would like to say now, this is where eGov actually implemented itself. How many places can eGov be in? So now this brings us to the second layer, right, of how eGov actually took a few shifts 6 years ago, right? So these were like technology shift from solution to product to platforms. There was a policy shift that going from city to states to national, and I'm talking about the institutionalization. And then there was an actor shift from eGov to Samaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar. So if you look at the actor shift today, all these impacts actually, we showcase it by a hockey stick impact. So in the first 13 years, there were about 500 cities. In the next 6, it reached 2,000 plus. And now with institutionalization at Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs within Mahua, it can reach 4,500 cities. And how do you make it possible? You have to get the bazaar involved in building that market capacity. So now there are more than 50 plus players who can participate in the RFPs, right? And just to kind of mention, there is this Upyog, which is the platform institutionalized by Mahua under NUDM. So Upyog is the urban platform for delivery of online governance. And NUDM is the National Urban Digital Mission, right? So there's a huge collaboration with Bazaar and Sarkar. Now I come to the next layer is of the product organizations and civic tech. So remember, Padma actually had to take out an app to, lodge that complaint. But now in Punjab, we find that people can log the grievance through WhatsApp. And that's a huge shift again, where we see that players on top of it can actually make these services more accessible to the citizens. So I guess all of these have enhanced citizen access to services through technology and DPG.
Thank you, Neeta. And I just realized that we have a large audience sitting actually in person in the room. And I should have actually begun by welcoming them to the event. I wasn't sure that this is a hybrid event and how many people. So welcome everybody who are in the room, and I hope we'll also get an opportunity to find a way to get you ask the questions to the panelists. I'll rely on the organizers to help me do that. But thank you so much, Neeta, for kind of bringing the words important. Of course, inclusion is a huge part of the public digital platforms, because there are private digital platforms who are all about scale, but it's the public part that brings in. I think you talked about dignity, empowerment, very important stuff, the Samaj Sarkar and the Bazaar. So we'll get into some of those things and some of the challenges to it in the next round. But now let me turn to the vendor, Mr. Damle. Who is in ONDC, and ONDC have been a huge, a big deal in many sense. People talk about in hyperbole about game changer, how the whole digital commerce is going to get transformed once ONDC come in. I know you come with a lot of hype, but we wanted to hear from you, So if you think about it today, UPI was meant with a similar intention, but if you look at today, the outcome, UPI, despite having this public digital platform, the two largest players are Google Pay and PhonePe. So we haven't really managed to avoid the concentration that we were worried about, and we still haven't managed to get the small players in. So what is ONDC going to do to make sure that we actually create a real competitive place where SMEs and others, MSMEs, can get access, affordable and inclusive access into digital commerce? So over to you, Devendra.
Thank you, Deepak, and thanks to ICRIER and Quantum Hub for having me on this panel. It's a great opportunity. So if we really look at what we are worried about or what we want to do in order to enable inclusivity, really the answer is just one, right? We want to reduce entry barriers, and everything else follows from there. And what Sarayu and Neeta also spoke about basically hints towards that as one of the intermediate outcomes towards getting other things. So in that sense, ONDC is a little bit of a shift from how we have been doing things. So Neeta described wonderfully what public platforms can do to enable access. ONDC, on the other hand, falls in what Sarayu called digital public infrastructure rather than digital public goods. Because ONDC is a bit of an abstraction from that concept of a platform, and ONDC is a network. So now what does this really mean? It means that ONDC has abstracted the way the different components of an e-commerce supply chain communicate with each other. So we have a common language, if you will, for all of the little components to speak to each other. And what that means is each of these elements can become a separate business. And unbundling naturally comes with greater competition. It reduces entry barriers, because if you think about it from a Kirana store's point of view, as a Kirana store now, I don't have to have the capacity to build an end-to-end e-commerce business. I don't need to be able to build my website. I don't need to have a tie-up with a payment aggregator to process payments. I don't need to build my inventory management software. At the same time, it's not like options don't exist right now. There are, but what happens right now is the platforms are proprietary, which means that you're locked into an ecosystem, and that de facto means that you're locked into a customer base. So what ONDC allows you to do is it allows every business to focus on what it is good at, right? So as a seller, I can focus on being good at maintaining my catalog and maintaining my inventory, and I can leave the customer acquisition and order management to somebody who is good at doing that. And all of this is enabled by the open standards that ONDC has developed. And so this is the entry part of it. Now, how competition is enabled on this, maybe we can take up later, because that's a slightly longer discussion. But the short answer to that is more choice. When you lower the entry barrier for anybody to connect into the network, it means that there are going to be more people who will be able to give them the sort of interfaces and gateways to connect to that network. And that's the core architectural element of lowering entry barriers. So what this does in effect is, because as a seller, I have more choices in how I connect to the network and what kind of business model I want to adopt. I can build my own system end to end, or I can go through a marketplace. I can get a SaaS software and connect whatever I want. There are lots of different ways of doing this. It means that I can start with a small set of things that I'm good at, and depending on how well I do, I can actually scale up and become a bigger player. So it solves for that entire range of scales of business in that sense. And one of the things that it does to reduce the market power asymmetry that exists between e-commerce platforms and vendors right now is that the open protocol also allows for dynamic negotiation, which means that not only are you not blocked into one platform, whenever you're getting into transactions, you can dynamically negotiate what terms and at what prices you want to do business. So this is a very, very short summary of how the technology works, but we can explore it a little more as we go along, because there are layers of governance also which come into play.
Thank you so much, Devendra, for keeping it short. And I must say, all of you have been very disciplined with the time. Thank you so much for that. So we heard a little bit on the kind of the general concept, some from the governance, urban governance, and then on the digital commerce. So I'll now turn to Anita, who is at Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and to hear from her on in terms of on the health sector story, but also the public digital platforms have been complementing or are substituting the work that your foundation does, and has it actually helped you to accelerate the way you have been providing your services, and how it has actually been helpful to your organization? Over to you.
Thanks, Deepak. And I greatly appreciate how the panel has been set up. I think there are very diverse but complementary perspectives that are coming in. And Deepak, just to help you with my name, it's Anita. So I know it's tricky, but I thought I'll get it out of the way. I think coming to your question, a disproportionate amount of our work in India, like you mentioned, is focused on supporting the government to strengthen the public health landscape of the country. I think we're all pretty familiar with how within digital health across different program areas, there have been challenges around, siloed, non-interoperable, monolith platforms getting developed, not just centrally, but even at the state level. Even now, we see challenges around APIs becoming available to be able to give the choice to the state government to, generate platforms which are much more centered around what the needs and the users' requirements are from a workflow perspective. We've seen, and we continue to see, but there is a change in the way it's being thought around, significant time and investment, not just spent by us, but across partners and even the government, reinventing the wheel from a software code perspective, from a content and innovations perspective across these very program-specific solutions or cadre-wise, solutions getting developed, which would either involve licensing fees every time or in a lot of states, especially the states we work in, unsuccessful bids going through, right? And I think with the India Health Stack, the NITI theme papers, and now with ABDM, we've definitely come a long way in even having these conversations with the government to actually understand the benefits of leveraging DPIs and DPGs. I think COVID-19 and UPI, I think we're all familiar, have really helped us accelerate a lot of these discussions in more ways than one. In the context of the work currently, I think the state governments, especially I work as a program officer for the states of UP and Bihar, and there are increased conversations around the benefits of this, around interoperability, around standards being used, the foundational building blocks getting adopted. And that thinking is coming into how it is absolutely essential when we are looking at digitalization efforts across the care continuum to enable last mile citizen service delivery. I think some of the things that I wanted to talk about were some of the challenges around this when we just come to the state governments and, for example, the procurement related challenges. So I think by definition, a lot of the principles for DPGs and DPIs talk about moving away from vendor lock-ins. But an important criteria that we need to consider that for every DPG, we need to have an ecosystem of partners to actually take this forward. In most LMICs, we know how the procurement cycle works. You need at least 3 bidders to come through to apply for the tender that's been floated. And that requires an ecosystem of local partners getting created who support then the deployment, configuration, customization of the platform in line with the needs of the users for that particular context. And I think that continues to be a big challenge. And just to give you an example, UP has the largest implementation of DHIS2 in the world, but we're reliant on a single partner to get that through. And that partner is also then taking up a responsibility for implementations across various countries and states as well. there is a single team, there is over-reliance on how that platform is maintained, how the code base is updated, how those tweaks and the more last mile efforts required to actually customize, configure it to the needs get then over-reliant on that platform. So in a way, we are still doing a vendor lock-in and also increasing the reliance on the donor agencies, right? Because since there is no other alternative partner to actually bid, it can never go through the procurement cycle. So we've locked in the government with a platform. We are continuously, supplementing that with funds, but we're not giving the government the ownership or the transition to be able to actually take this forward on their own. So that was one thing I thought I could bring out. I think the other, which now I feel the community at large is thinking about, is that, and we saw this with COVID. I remember in June of 2020, there were over 80 plus application software platforms that were developed for similar or overlapping use cases for COVID, right? And we see that happening across various situations and various use cases, especially in health, because state governments like that flexibility. Health is a state subject. They want to be able to develop and at the pace at which they want to develop and have the turnaround for how the tweaks and the features should be developed. But the use cases continue to be overlapping. And that's where DPGs can play a very key role to avoid such duplication of efforts. And that would basically mean, if there is no DPG being used for these use cases, that would mean at a pilot stage, there'll be several applications developed with donor funding, which would be done in a siloed manner. There is no optimization of utilization of funds or resources in that bargain. And versus, having a more intentional way of thinking through some of these common use cases, which every state or even at the national level will be thought about and will be focused upon. So I think that would be a second place where I feel for specific use cases, helping the funding agencies also to streamline what to put funds behind is something that we can think through a lot better.
Yes, that's terrific. Thank you, Anaita. My apology for mispronouncing your name. I think you guys covered a lot of interesting things in terms of how public digital platforms have made kind of the overall development process a lot more inclusive, more efficient, and more innovative in terms of creating new ways of doing things. I think you talked about reducing fragmentation, perhaps leading to better outcomes, fiscal savings. So there's a whole host of positive that you can talk about, and we can take the whole day and talk about all the good things that public digital platform can do. But I'm now going to turn to the challenges, and I want you guys to be all very honest and forthright in saying some of the real challenges that we face, whether it's about governance structure, accountability, rights, cybersecurity, privacy, whatever you think are the biggest problems in your domain areas that we all need to think about as we're building up these systems, because these systems are going to stay with us for decades. And so we need to build them right. So with that, let me turn first to Neeta. And I think I'm going to ask the same questions in different ways, but focusing on each of your area. So share some of the challenges that you think that you have faced in creating, promoting, and implementing the public digital platforms from your perspective.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking that question, because I think this is something from now on we need to delve into more. DPGs have established, I think we have linked them to SDGs. So I think that's a done debate, all agree. Because when you start going and implementing it on the field, we need to all, and this is a fantastic platform to be doing that. So if I start with challenges on the creating of DPGs, I would kind of, and Anaita is here, we are funded by BMGF. And I would say, the biggest challenge is that it is a long-term game. It is a decadal journey, right? So you are talking about putting together a foundational infrastructure. So what it needs is a really patient risk capital. I think that's very important. And here I would say that we find funders usually fund the programs, right? But who is funding this risk capital for actually creating the platform, right? And I can tell you that as we are forging into Africa, right? So obviously we talked about, or maybe I'll cover later on, that capacity is a huge issue. And if we find that in India, in Africa, it is of a different magnitude altogether. So we are kind of trying to say, okay, in such countries, I think we should even simplify more, because you will not find, I mean, for Digit itself, finding the right kind of people to work on these cutting edge technology, which is, used in Netflix and Facebook, etc. REST APIs, you're talking of Kubernetes. How many people are there who can do that? Africa, it is zero. So if I have to make it absolutely easy for them, like SaaS as a platform, who is funding the core? Right? So I think that's where it is. And Anayata, we had a very senior official from a person from Bill and Melinda Gates who came, and when he saw a chart of the core and everything sort of, and he said, oh my God, we should be funding the core and funding everybody, all of the DPGs who actually interoperate with it. I mean, it felt so good hearing him say that, because that's really the crux of it. Because I have seen in my experience when I was in digital health with on NCD, I almost felt it is like, it's like a landmine of different, you go and talk to any A&M, she will shudder if you come to her and say there is another, app with a different login, etc. So I think we all can. So that is one. And the second is, I would say, at the design stage, because this has to be designed for scale. It has to be designed keeping in mind the federated structure of the country and other countries, It has to keep in mind the privacy. It has to be designed to give agency to people and inclusiveness. So Apti's, we have Sarayu here, and we have done some, I think, fabulous work on the marginalized impact of marginalized communities and role of intermediaries with you. And that's the support we get, in the creation. So I'll move on now to the promoting challenges. When you come to promoting, it is about reimagining. And that's a huge challenge again. And you need to collaborate with different actors to propagate it, right? And for that, you need market capacity. Where is the market with the capacity and the incentives, right? So that is the second, that's a challenge in promoting, and that's where eGov have spent humongous, significant amount of time and energy. And I'm talking about some 20,000 hours, some 2,000 plus documents, because for DPGs, that's very important. Otherwise, how I'm finding so-called DPGs where there is no documentation, there are no open APIs. I can see Anayata nodding on that, because that's a true, right? So I think we have a Digit Academy to prepare the market for the go-to-market, go to our Sarkar, and basically then make it happen. Participate in RFPs, right? So do that. And then when we come to the implementation challenges, which is, I think, my favorite, when I go to a state and talk about it, capacity of the state can be a huge issue, which I referred to, when I was talking about the funding, that where are the people? Where are the people with those capabilities? Where is the institutional structure? I'll give you an example in one of the states without naming it, that when we were implementing, I actually decided to just drive down to the municipality, right? And when I went there were no computers which were working. There was a computer, but it was virus ridden. And where are the people who were trained? So I immediately actually called the principal secretary and I said, what is happening? Because he's not aware of it. And when I asked the people, they said, we can't say it. So, these are the challenges which don't even come up to that level. So how do you get started? And then procurement. I think one of you mentioned, I think either it is Sarayu or, Anayata, that procurement can take ages. So I'll stop here. There are probably many more challenges, but these are what come to my top of my mind.
Yeah, thank you, Neeta. I think these are very practical challenges that you brought in, which are very important when you are, walking on in the field at the front line. So these are very important points. Now let me turn to Sarayu again for, who is obviously in a place where you are, not only shaping the, you are in the middle of the things, you're shaping the way this whole evolution is happening. So tell us, does the openness of this technology effectively embody the principles of transparency and accountability? Are we actually thinking about it as we start doing it? And what do you think we've got right and what we've got wrong? And again, I really appreciate all of us to stick to 3 to 4 minutes so that we can give some time to our audience to ask questions. Thank you. Sarai, over to you.
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. Thank you very much for that question. I think it's a difficult one because, notions of transparency and accountability have all become fuzzy words in their own rights. And so thinking of applying it to an evolving and dynamic concept such as public digital goods, infrastructures, and all of what it contains within it has its trickiness. But to the point that Neeta said, I think she put it really very well. It's as much on the technological side as on the governance side. It is a multi-decadal journey, and one that is not completed until there's a journey that needs to sort of happen. So notions of transparency and accountability, which are embedded in the governance layer that sits alongside the core technology, it's something that happens over a period of time. I think one critical element, I think Neeta already sort of set the ground for me to say this, which is that financing and the way in which these sort of technological infrastructures and the governance systems around them are sustained is actually very, very important. So we did some work on looking at financing digital infrastructures and digital goods. And our big finding is, particularly when philanthropies are involved that are willing to sort of accommodate some of the risks that come with it, or the public, the state itself is involved in some senses, then notions of transparency and accountability are more present upfront, shall we say, rather than necessarily accounted for upfront. So I feel like that part of it is one thing to remember. The second, I just want to very quickly sort of touch upon something that Neeta said. The notion of vendor lock-in and lack of capacities are very closely tied together. So we also do work with another digital public good, which hopes to be digital public infrastructures through the instantiation, which is MOSIP, which is an identity project. And I suppose the most base way of putting it is to call it Aadhaar for the world. And their approach has constantly been to go out into countries and not just provide a system, because, it's another kind of vendor lock-in in its own right, but engage with the university system, with academics, with communities of coders to build that capacity at the country level. So there's a certain transference of skills that is involved in addition to deployment. So I think that's another example to keep in mind. Tackling very quickly the notion of openness, I think I alluded to some of the struggles, but there are many different notions of it. One is, of course, the code and the open source code. Is it open or is it not? Is it open API? And then, of course, it relates to a value system question in and of itself. So, for example, Beacon, which in some way underlies the ONDC, is open source. UPI is not open source code, it's open API, which allows innovations to sort of come and engage with it. So there are all of these notions of openness and tussling with the notion of open source code, which has been identified as one of the critical elements by the Digital Public Goods Alliance of what is a digital public good. Again, is something to be debated. In terms of what India has done well, and I'm sorry I'm rushing through it, and hopefully we can come back to some of these notions over the course of the conversation. I think India has very significantly not just built the digital core. It's been a difficult process, but there's a digital core. But through a fractious, debated, challenging process, also navigated some of the questions around inclusion, universality, etc. Which means that both from the perspective of legal and rights-based systems, as well as from a very functional sense, questions of inclusion have been tackled. It has also tackled the notion of inclusivity from the innovation side. I think with the UPI, for example, I think Devendra alluded to it, which is the idea that, primarily it's been Google Pay, Paytm, and a few other innovators on it. With ONDC, the effort seems to be upfront to sort of bring the innovation journey to a wider set of innovators. So the notion of inclusion from that sense is also being tackled quite significantly. Civil society has been engaged, again, fractious, but has been engaged. And, very much of the imagination around digital goods in India has been with the citizen at the heart. So these are the things that India has done well. And of course, there are quite a few lessons, particularly in a context where the digital divide is so stark, such as in India, the notion of open when it's read to be inclusive is really difficult to do. And then, the governance around inclusion still remains to be done. But I think to the point that Neeta made, this is very much a journey. And so one should see it as such. And constantly engage with sort of the levers, particularly financing, statutory regulations, as well as a vocal and robust community of civil society actors to continue tackling the question of inclusion. I'll pause here and hand back to you, Deepak.
And sorry for rushing you all in. We have 3:20. We started about 4 minutes late. But let me now turn to Devender. I think you have a really interesting situation here. You have already seen some of the downside problems and challenges facing some of the past DPIs that we have. So I wanted to understand, how is ONDC taking that already into account in terms of making sure that some of those governance challenges are already built into the platform?
Thanks, Deepak. So one thing as a principle that we always keep that keeps us grounded is that we are not a regulator and we are not a platform. So our job is to be an enabler, and we approach everything from that point of view. And the idea is then to create a layer of governance which only operates to the degree required and as little as required, and whenever possible, including all of the people who are actually part of that ecosystem. So what does it mean now in brass tacks? So the what we have is it's a two-layered approach, actually technically a three-layered approach, because the laws of the land are at the top. But what ONDC has prepared as a network enabler, and which is primarily my job as the policy person, is to put in place a set of policies for network governance, which set the ground rules for anybody who is a participant in the network that they have to abide by. The second piece is I mentioned it earlier, a transaction level contract, which allows, that's a piece of technology effectively, which allows businesses to figure out their terms of engagement, which creates some amount of parity and governance in itself, because you're creating hard-coded, monitorable contracts. Now, great, we have the rules of engagement, we have the technology. Now, what happens when things go wrong? So for that, we have a monitoring and enforcement framework, which we are building out. A large part of it is going to be automated, as you can imagine, because at scale, we can't have people looking at dashboards and making decisions. Now, within that, what happens if something goes wrong? Because again, we are an enabler, right? We are not a regulator. We can't say that you are fined so much for doing something wrong. So to the extent possible, we are going to try to guide behavior by nudges and by placing some soft restrictions on people. So again, we're figuring out the systems of how that is going to work. But one of the pieces that we're developing is what we call a network-wide reputation or a network-wide score. So if your platform does something unsavory, goes against the rules, the first thing that will happen is your score gets hit. So whenever you're transacting with anybody else, that becomes a consideration, because that becomes a marker of your overall trust of should somebody be doing business with you. That's one. And the other one, which is a little more, let's say, intrusive for the lack of a better word, is to conduct regular certifications and audits. Because there are lots of pieces of this network which are not immediately visible to anybody. But we have to make sure that they function according to the rules that we've set. To give you a small example, the buyer side applications are responsible for search and discovery of products. Now, how do we make sure that they don't unfairly advantage a certain set of sellers? We can't go into their software, that it's antithetical to our principles. As a network, we don't want to do it either, but that function has to be performed. So then instead of us doing it and becoming a regulator, we have a framework where they can get certified and audited for it, and it becomes a periodic review sort of process. And the last piece, like I said, we are building out governance bodies for different aspects of network governance, which include network participants. And this sort of, I just want to touch upon what Saryu mentioned, which was the difference between open source and open APIs, and which also ties into the question you asked me in the first round, which just to quickly round this off. How are we going to make sure, or what are we doing to make sure that there is this whole thing doesn't get concentrated again like UPI does? First of all, we have to recognize that there are certain very major differences between these two sectors. UPI is operating in a sector which is highly regulated to begin with. So there are lots of concerns around financial consumer protection and fraud and so on. E-commerce, not so much, like the parity in regulation isn't there. And the second thing is precisely what Sir you pointed out too. ONDC is taking an open access and open source sort of approach. So anybody who wants to develop an ONDC compliant application, they can go to the ONDC GitHub, download the specification, start building the application. There are reference app they can start testing. So what that allows and what makes it different from UPI is that lots of different business models are possible, which automatically means that there is competition. You can disaggregate in different ways, and that sort of not directly, but as a consequence, takes care of this problem of too much concentration taking place. I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Devendra. It's very reassuring to hear from you in some of the things that you're already thinking upfront on this. Let me quickly turn to Anahita for the last question. And I'm going to mix a question that has come on the chat box for you also. So one is, I think there's a lot of worry about the fact that, India is still a very gender unequal state, and a lot of hope that digital technology is going to, change that, and public digital platform is, even more inclusive. And so, do you see that in terms of usage, in terms of the service delivery, that are we improving the gender inequality, or are we actually deteriorating it? And second is there's there's G20 is in the air. There's a lot of discussion about India's G20 presidency. Given that you operate, or your organization operates in many parts of the world, tell us a little bit about India's approach to making public digital platform a priority in G20, and what India can actually, in some ideas for the rest of the world as its president. 3 minutes, Anahita, if you don't mind.
Sure, I'll try to. Very, very loaded questions, both of them, but I'll try. I think on the gender inequality, at least, I just feel firstly we're talking about it. I think in all the programs, I used to work on the implementation side before this, and whenever we were talking about design, we would talk about user centricity very loosely and never go beyond that. And now we talk about gender inequality and being much more intentional when we are designing solutions, when we are implementing solutions, what language to use, how the workflows should be generated, what the frequency of targeted interventions should be, etc. So I think there is thinking going into it. I feel it's still very early stage. I do think all of us have a role to play to ensure that it becomes a part of the daily parlance of how we think about digital technologies going forward. It's also very contextual. It's also very localized in several places. So we need to also think about some of those nuances. And that really, to my mind, the last point on this one would be involving the communities when you're designing becomes increasingly important if you want it to be representative of what actually the user base looks like. So I'll just summarize that with that. On the G20 and the whole DPG for the rest of the world, I think it's front and center. It's a very important part of and a very important thematic area. India for the world has been something that the country has been demonstrating in different manners. I think the COVID platform with DIVOC, we already have use cases and several learnings to take ahead as we go on with this. I think certain factors to probably keep in mind while we're on this journey of leveraging DPGs. I think Neeta, Saryu, and Devendra made my job really easy. I think I'll quickly summarize 3 points in the interest of time. One, I think whoever is adopting the DPG would want to ensure that there is an assurance that the core platform, the core base of the platform will also be there. So there is like Neeta mentioned about the journey we're all embarking on. The government requires at least a minimum of a 10-year visibility to get a platform adopted, to ensure there is a hosting agency, for a lack of a better word, in place, so that that core platform is maintained, updated, the core code base is kept updated as much as possible. So that's number one. I think secondly, and we see this a lot, and we can also be held responsible in a lot of occasions. We're still learning that structurally it's important to get the right kind of visibility on the product roadmap. And we understand, and we've seen this enough now, that how either a big funding agency or one of the big implementation agencies ends up playing a instrumental role of influencing what that roadmap could look like, which may not be something of benefit for the rest of the implementations that are out there or the other areas where this is being implemented. So I think very specifically the organization which manages the core product roadmap, just taking Sunbird from Akestep as an example, they should have the flexibility and the freedom to manage that core product roadmap and not have to, get influenced by differing priorities, which are either programmatic or projectized, etc. And I think to do that, the funding group, which is behind and supporting these platforms, since we're still figuring out what the business model for such things would look like, I think they should be steering clear of the steering group, which is actually taking the platform forward. So if those two intertwine, I think that's when it becomes really tricky. And some of the things that can be done while we're thinking about this is, for example, on a rotational basis, there are a lot of, at least in the Indian ecosystem, Neeta alluded to what's the status in Africa. I think that we can have a set of advisors to direct what that product roadmap looks like, and that could be a rotational set of advisors. And it also links to the sustainability of these DPGs and even the various design elements that we were talking about earlier. I think the last thing is something that I'll very quickly cover, and we are trying to do a better job at this, is around developing that ecosystem and making this a criteria upfront for every DPG. And one of the things that we are trying to do better on is that, we typically work with 2-3 set of partners and end up going to those partners itself to create that ecosystem, which doesn't really help. To create that local ecosystem also, and to be able to have them bid and then set up these teams, because we know how, at scale implementations work in the Indian context. We need to be able to diversify the pool of partners who are creating that ecosystem as well. I'll just pause here.
Thank you, Naita. This was wonderful. It felt a bit like a rapid fire round. I think there's so many questions that we wanted to go over, but unfortunately we were given 50 minutes. There are 4 speakers and we want to cover both the benefits and the risks, but I think we did a pretty decent job of covering all the grounds. And so thank you so much, Sarayu, Neeta, Devinder, and Anaita for being wonderful speakers. We did try to weave in at least one question. I think it came from Mr. Kapil Goyal. We don't have time. I've been already reminded by everybody from organizer side to wind it up. So just to very quickly, 30-second summary, I think I take it that, this whole digital public platform is a multi-decadal journey, as one of you mentioned. I think we need a lot of patience, as a capital, as producers, consumers. I think we need a design to scale. We need to think of a federated structure of the country, multilingual status, giving agents to people. I think we believe that the technology is helping already to make the process more inclusive and efficient and innovative, but there's a lot to be done. And I think a lot of the challenges that you focused on, especially on the ground, are super important. So I'm sure people who are thinking about this are taking into account. People like Devinder, who is in the middle of rolling out Paras, one of the most important platform. Even if an ONDC says we are not a platform, everybody says we are a platform. That's it. So thank you so much. I think I can't do justice to the rich discussion we had, but I just want to thank you very much for this. Lastly, wanted to thank Ashwira Vishwanathan, Shiva Kanwar, Rohit Kumar, and Mansi Kedia from the Quantum Hub and ICRIA for organizing this event and making us, feeding us all the questions and the preparation process to make it so smooth. So thank you, everyone, and all the best, and hope to see you in another session.
Thank you. Bye-bye. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.